Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and you may be aware that there was no race this past weekend. But we are exactly 6 races through a 24-race season, which puts us through the first quarter of the season. And one of the things that we say in Formula One is that your only true competition is your teammate. And with that being said, I actually wanted to go through the numbers and compare teammates to teammates and see where we stack up. Because when we talk about progress through a season and who's successful and who's not, usually what we look at in terms of that measurement of success is just point standings, pole positions, race finishes, and podiums, but that is in comparison to the entirety of the grid. What I actually want to do today is go through the comparison of teammate to teammates where you're actually in the same machinery, and then we'll also look at our 6 rookies on the grid and see where everyone stacks up in terms of experience. That being said, obviously there are certain points where you have to look at things and say, okay, this person is new to the team, this person is a brand new rookie versus someone who's very experienced, and these rookies have better cars than the other rookies. There are, of course, a lot of different factors that are actually going to give us variables where we can talk about that in consideration of like what we actually think is the truth of who's better, who's not. But what I want to look at is these actual numbers. Most of what we talk about is conjecture, it's opinion. But if we actually look at these numbers one by one, what will we see? And then what kind of analysis can we actually draw out of that? And is it a little bit more fair to look at these drivers and compare them to someone who's on the same path as them, whether that's their teammate in equal machinery or one of the other 5 rookies on the grid? So let's go ahead and dive in. We are, of course, going to start with the championship leaders, McLaren. Not only are they the championship leaders, their 2 drivers are also 1 and 2 in the Drivers' Championship. Oscar Piastri is currently first in the Drivers' Championship with 131 points, and his teammate Lando Norris is right behind him with 115 points. But let's break down how we got here. In terms of qualifying, head-to-head, just in the Grand Prix races, they're actually tied. Lando Norris has outqualified Oscar 3 times, and Oscar Piastri has outqualified Lando 3 times. However, that difference can be made up a little bit when you look at their average qualifying position. Lando Norris's average qualifying position for the first chunk of the season is P4, and Oscar Piastri's average qualifying position is just over 2 at 2.166 repeating. Lando's best qualifying position was actually the very first race in Australia where he took pole position. His worst qualifying position is P10 in Saudi Arabia, but Oscar has a much more steady qualifying rate. His best qualifying position is also pole position, but he's done so twice, in the second race of the season in China, as well as in Bahrain. And his worst qualifying position was actually in our 6th race of the season in Miami, where he qualified P4. So when we look at qualifying specifically, we see one major difference between these 2 teammates, and that is that Oscar makes less mistakes. We've seen Oscar qualify within the top 4 every single race this season, whereas Lando has made it all the way to Q3 every race this season, but has had some variation in what that qualifying looks like. And most notably, Lando also had one major mistake in Saudi Arabia, which ended in him not actually finishing Q3, which ends in him at P10 in qualifying. However, what is interesting is when you compare the 2 of them when they actually are in the race itself, their average finishing position is not only almost identical, Lando is slightly ahead of Oscar. Lando's average finishing position for these first 6 races is 2.334, and very close behind him is Oscar at 2.666. I'm using a lot of these extra decimal points because these averages are not round numbers, but what you need to know is that it's a very marginal difference between Lando's average finish and Oscar's average finish. However, if you look at their average qualifying positions, Lando is actually making up more positions in the race itself. Now, it's kind of not necessarily a fair comparison, because when you look at the fact that Oscar is actually out-qualifying Lando to some degree, as I said, they've gone head-to-head and they're exactly even. But in these races where Lando is making up these positions, Oscar doesn't necessarily have to because he is out-qualifying. And generally speaking, not necessarily for the excitement of the race, but for a winner, you'd be happy to consistently qualify at the top and not have to overtake throughout the race and just maintain that lead. But if we compare that overtaking in a race, the most amount of places that Lando made up in a race was in Saudi Arabia from P10 to P4, and the most amount of positions that Oscar made up was in Miami from P4 to the race win. However, one of the big race results that is kind of pulling Oscar's stats down differently from Lando's was that opening race in Australia, where instead of making up positions, he actually lost a number of them. Oscar qualified P2 in Australia, but finished P9. So when we look at the trend of how these drivers are tracking, Lando's performance has actually dropped since the beginning of the season, and Oscar's has actually trended upwards. A couple of other stats that we can easily see: Lando has had 1 pole position this season, and Oscar has had 2. Lando has had 1 race win, and Oscar has had 4. And when it comes to podiums, they're actually even at 5 each. And something else that I thought was actually kind of interesting to look at was, for all drivers, their average differential from the leader of the race to their time. And because Oscar has won so many of these races, it's easier to see how close they are in comparison. Oscar has an average of across all races being about 3.7 seconds off the race time, whereas Lando has an average of about 6.8 seconds. So you can see about a 3-second time differential between the 2 of them. And most of that is based off the fact that Oscar Oscar has won more races than Lando has. So he's going to obviously have a smaller time off the time differential because generally speaking, he's the one setting it. However, it's interesting to see that the gap is not necessarily huge, but it's also not necessarily super close. I think if we kind of put our analysis hats on, a lot of this has to do with the fact that when the McLaren does get into clean air, we are seeing it get faster and faster every week. And so the more amount of time that one of the drivers spends battling other drivers on track, if their teammate is already ahead of them and leading the race, which we have seen to be the case a number of times here, that time differential is going to be added up, but the other driver is going to make up a lot of that time as they're chasing their teammate down if they are able to clear the other drivers on track. We saw this in particular in Miami with Lando and Max. Oscar was already ahead of Max and starting to gain a lot of that time. And by the time Lando was done battling with Max and getting into P2, Oscar had a very large cushion. However, we did see him lap after lap start to cut into that gap. And so what I think will be interesting to kind of track over the rest of the season is how far apart they really are. And if one of those drivers is faster than the other objectively in the same car. Because what we are seeing, comparing the two of them head to head, is that Lando and Oscar have outqualified each other the same amount, 3 races to 3 races. However, across the board, Oscar is on average qualifying higher than Lando is, meaning that even though Lando and Oscar have outqualified each other the same amount of times, is that when Oscar does outqualify Lando, Lando tends to be further down the ranks in terms of where he qualifies. That gap between where Oscar ends up and Lando ends up is bigger than when Lando outqualifies Oscar, which means that in single lap qualifying pace, Oscar is generally winning. However, when you look at race pace and the fact that we actually see Lando's average finishing position higher than Oscar's, even though Oscar has won more races, when we look at the race itself, there is this possibility that if Lando can fix his qualifying issues, and if he can start to outqualify Oscar, he may be the faster one on track objectively. Again, this is really just looking at the data, at the numbers, but a lot of those numbers are affected by the fact that Lando had a stronger start to the season and Oscar has had a stronger trend upwards. What will be interesting to see is that if Lando does fix that qualifying problem, if he finds a way to start being the one outqualifying Oscar consistently, will we see Oscar be able to catch up to Lando in a race the same way that Lando is usually able to catch up to Oscar? Lando is, generally speaking, cutting into that gap when Oscar is ahead. The question would be, if those two things switch, if Oscar is the one who is qualifying behind Lando, could Oscar make the same moves through the race itself? But one of the other data points to kind of add back in, which makes these a little bit more complicated, is the sprint races. It's important to note that we have only had 2 sprint races, one in China and one in Miami. However, let's look at those head-to-heads as well, because all of the numbers I gave you before this were just on Grand Prix wins. Lando has managed 1 sprint pole to Oscar's no sprint poles. Lando has had 1 sprint podium to Oscar's 2 sprint podiums. And Lando's won 1 sprint race and Oscar has won none. Lando's picked up 9 points in the sprint races and Oscar has picked up an additional 14. So of their 16-point differential in the entire championship standings, 5 of those points are actually from the sprint race spread. What's interesting is that if you look at the numbers objectively, Oscar is having a better run at things, but Lando had a better start and he has a better track record for making up more positions in the race itself. 6 races in, it's hard to say which way they're going to continue to trend. What the numbers tell us is that the major difference between the two of them is qualifying, and that Lando would need to start out qualifying Oscar in order to have that edge. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that the McLaren is just so fast. If one of these drivers is out qualifying the other consistently, and they find themselves consistently early on in the race ahead of their teammate, the speed of the McLaren in clean air is going to make it much more difficult for the other driver to make up that gap. So if we want to have a tighter fight, Lando has to work on qualifying, and he has to work on his starts, which has been something that we've talked about for a long time. Because what Lando needs is to be higher up in qualifying than Oscar, and to be able to hold that track position as we get into the race. If he's able to do that, we'll find most likely that he then has the advantage in the car, but that he builds that gap between himself and his teammate early on, and that Oscar then becomes the one who has to make up positions in the race itself. Because the question with the McLaren really seems to be which driver gets out first, and which driver can build a comfortable cushion in that speedy car. It's an interesting question, and I think the numbers point to whichever driver gets out there first, and whichever driver has the most clean air for the longest period of time is the driver that's going to come out on top. So what we'll be looking for coming into this next quarter of the season is which driver is able to do that, and if there seem to be any more obstacles that these drivers have. Because one thing we really haven't seen is if both of those drivers are qualifying lower in the grid. Oscar has never had to fight from a further position back than 4. And so the question is, if we had a race where both of these drivers were qualifying further down the field, say 5th and 6th, which driver would actually finish ahead? Which driver would be able to make their way through the field quicker? The data kind of points to Lando, but it's hard to say with just this small amount of data, mostly mostly because we haven't seen Oscar have to do it yet. So those are kind of your numbers for the head-to-head with McLaren. Let's move on to Mercedes. Now, Mercedes is currently second in the Constructors' Championship, and they have two drivers, George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. It's important to remember that George Russell has been with the team for a while, and Kimi Antonelli is not only a rookie, but only 18 years old. And even though they're currently second in the Constructors' Championship directly behind McLaren, their drivers currently stand in the Drivers' Championship at 4th for George Russell and 6th for Kimi Antonelli. Now let's break down some of that head-to-head data. George Russell has outqualified Kimi Antonelli 5 times this season, and Kimi Antonelli has outqualified George only 1 time. George's average qualifying position over those first 6 Grand Prix is 3.5, while Kimi Antonelli's average qualifying position is 7. And on average, George's race finish is actually the same as his qualifying, 3.5. But Kimi Antonelli is a slight improvement on his own qualifying average position at 6.5. So just at a quick glance, it's easy to see that George Russell is on paper actually performing better than Kimi Antonelli. And it's kind of a lose-lose situation because of course he should be, right? He's been on the team for longer, he's been in Formula 1 for significantly longer, and Kimi Antonelli is just jumping into Formula 1 with very little experience himself and getting comfortable with the team. However, if we dive a little bit more into the numbers, there's a couple of interesting points here. Out of 6 races, George has actually only improved his position in 2 of them. In Australia, he qualified 4th and finished 3rd, and in Miami, he qualified 5th and finished 3rd again. In the remaining 4 races, 2 of those he actually just maintained the position that he qualified in. In Japan, he qualified and finished 5th, and in Bahrain, he qualified and finished 2nd. And in China and Saudi Arabia, he actually lost positions. In China, he qualified 2nd but finished 3rd, and in Saudi Arabia, he qualified 3rd but he finished 5th. Now let's look at Kimi Antonelli's positions here. The most impressive in terms of positions made up was Australia. This was Kimi Antonelli's first Formula 1 race, and he qualified 16th, but he finished that race P4. In China, he made up 2 positions, qualifying 8th and finishing 6th. In Japan, he just maintained his position, which to be fair, most people did in Japan. He qualified 6th and he finished 6th. And then these last 3 races, while he has been qualifying higher, he has also been losing positions. In Bahrain, he qualified 4th and finished 11th. In Saudi Arabia, he qualified 5th and finished 6th. And in Miami, he qualified 3rd and finished 6th. However, when we look at those numbers, what's interesting is that it's not necessarily a decline in performance. What we're actually seeing from Kimi is that for the first half of this season, he really struggled with qualifying. Obviously in Australia, he was knocked out early, but then we've seen him improve. So that first half, the reason why he's so able to make up a lot of those positions is that he's often fighting through drivers that are further down in the field. So qualifying 16th and finishing 4th is very impressive, but a lot of those overtakes are people with slower cars and, generally speaking, a lot of the other rookies. But the story with Kimi really comes down to the fact that now that he has figured out how to qualify better, he has to get comfortable racing at the top of the grid. That is something that George is already comfortable with, but it is something that he also struggles with. So far from last year, we are seeing a better improvement for George on this. One of the things that we saw often last year is that he would outqualify his teammate Lewis Hamilton, but by the end of the race, they would be side by side. Usually that was due to the fact that George would lose positions and Lewis would make them up. And it seems like we may be seeing a similar pattern in his new teammate. While Kimi Antonelli qualifies lower than George, he does seem to be more comfortable moving through the field. Now what we need to see is which of them can hold their own in the front, because what we're starting to see is an improvement in Kimi's performance when it comes to qualifying. And we saw that specifically with the fact that he became the youngest pole sitter in Formula 1 history in any format with the sprint race in Miami. And so if they are going to start performing in a way that qualifying puts them head to head pretty close, it will come down to which of these drivers is more comfortable racing against the best of the best. Which of these drivers, when they're up in the top 4 positions, is able to maintain their position and gain positions. And which of these drivers is better at fighting for race wins? Out of the last 6 races, George actually has 4 podiums. But the question will be whether or not he can actually not only maintain that, but if he can fight for pace with the McLarens. Could he actually win a race in this car? And if his own teammate in the same car, which has been performing pretty well, is becoming more competitive directly with him, which of the 2 of them succeeds under pressure? Personally, I think this question is going to start to be answered when we talk about ceiling. Which of these 2 drivers has a higher ceiling in terms of development? Which of them is going to go further in their long-term career? My inclination and my gut is that we're going to see Kimi Antonelli, who right now is raw talent with little experience, ultimately outperform George, though it will take some time for that to be the case. And the question really will be, if George has competition from a young teammate, does he really ratchet up his performance? Because at the beginning of the season, he obviously had this comfort of being able to outperform Kimi automatically, outqualifying Kimi very regularly and therefore consistently outperforming him by having less to do in the race. But the question really comes down to whether or not this current Mercedes car could be a race winner and what it looks like when the 2 of them are directly competing with each other, when they are qualifying right next to each other. Which one of them will be able to maintain better race pace, and what can this car really do? Another reminder is that we currently don't know if George will be returning to the team next year. His contract is up at the end of this season, and we have have not actually seen him renew said contract, at least publicly. So the question will be, does George stay? And now that Kimi's performance is actually kind of pushing upwards, does Mercedes wait longer to make that decision? Does Kimi impress so much that they feel like they can wait and see if Kimi ultimately outperforms George? And if in one season Kimi does start to outperform George, what does that mean for George's future with the team? I think objectively, we've actually seen a really good performance from George, and that's not necessarily for some reason something that's often celebrated. George has actually been putting in great performance. He's been on the podium 4 out of 6 times, and I do think we should acknowledge that. But the real question I have is that once Kimi gets comfortable, what does their head-to-head look like? And I think we'll have to look at that in another 6 races. Once we're through another quarter of this and halfway through the season, what does it look like head-to-head? But ultimately, it's actually kind of an interesting performance here. George, you kind of have to feel for a little bit. Since he moved to Mercedes, he's been in the shadow of 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, and he's never really had a chance to shine. And as soon as Lewis decides to leave and go to another team, to go to Ferrari, George seems like he'll have this chance to shine, to really become the face of the team. And immediately, your teammate becomes the biggest story on the grid last year. An 18-year-old rookie that feels relatively untested, getting a Formula One seat with a top team. So the question is, if that rookie starts to outperform George, or at least even actually maintain performance head-to-head, what does that mean when this is only Kimi's first year in Formula One? And can George maintain his performance and maintain his control over this team? Because we do kind of know that Kimi is viewed as the future of Mercedes. And again, what does that mean for George? My prediction on this one, I think we're going to see Kimi really get comfortable. And I think that means we're going to see a lot of direct head-to-head competition between the two of them. But the thing that I really would like to see, which one of these Mercedes drivers is able to convert this car into a win first? And I think there would be kind of something cool about it being Kimi. Though either way, I always feel that competition breeds better performance from both. So if George is not able to get comfortable and really believe that he is that first driver at Mercedes, I think that means he'll continue performing as high as he is. Because we know that right now, these first 6 races, he's been fighting for a contract renewal. And we also know that Kimi is fighting to prove that he deserves the seat that he has. When both of those drivers really have something to prove, clearly we're getting better performance from both of them. And the question is, who comes out on top? The next team that we're talking about is Red Bull, but it's a little complicated this season, isn't it? Because while their star, Max Verstappen, has obviously been very consistent at that team, he has had 2 different teammates this season. So in order to talk about this team, we are going to go a little bit out of order, and we're going to talk about Red Bull and VCARB at the same time. To be fair to all 4 of the drivers that are involved, I'm going to do these comparisons kind of split based off of when they started racing. And this will be kind of an interesting conversation in this section because I want to talk about a few different things. 1, is the car the problem? 2, were these drivers given a fair shot? And 3, of the 4 drivers, which ones show the most potential? Or objectively, I think we're going to have to say of 3 drivers that aren't Max Verstappen, which ones show the most potential? Because, you know, he is still Max Verstappen. So let's start with the original teammate pairings. For the first 2 races of this season, Red Bull was made up of Max Verstappen and Liam Lawson. Even though we've been talking about Liam Lawson as a rookie, technically speaking, he did not enter this season as a rookie because he had already raced too many races in Formula One due to his role as a reserve driver, as well as his replacement of Daniel Ricciardo mid-season at VCARB last year. So to give a fair comparison, while this is Liam's first full year in Formula One, his first race in Formula One was actually 2 seasons ago. And last season, he did have a chunk of races at the end of the season to prepare. But as we know, it was a very short-lived situation, so we're really just comparing them head-to-head for 2 races, the Australia season opener and the second race in China. Max did outqualify Liam in both of those races. Max qualified 3rd in Australia and 4th in China. And Liam, unfortunately, didn't even make it out of Q1 in either of those races, qualifying 18th in Australia and 20th in China. As far as race results, Max actually finished 2nd in Australia and Liam did not finish the race. And in China, Max held his 4th position, not gaining any positions from qualifying. And Liam actually made up 8 positions, finishing 12th. As we know, Liam only finished 1 race in his time at Red Bull, and that was in China. Finishing 12th, he was just over 1 minute and 21 seconds behind the leader. And to bring in the sprint from China as well, one thing that we should look at is the fact that he qualified 20th and again did make up a number of positions there. He finished the sprint race in 14th. And just by virtue of the race being shorter, he was just over 44 seconds longer than the final race time of the leader. Now, I think to compare Max Verstappen directly to his teammate is pretty unfair. We know that that Red Bull car is going to be tailored to the driver who has won 4 championships in it. We also know that Max is more comfortable with the team. And to be fair, Max was not dominating in these first 2 races. We did not see him have a race win until the 3rd race in Japan, and that has been the only race he's won this season. And just to throw that sprint race in China in, Max actually qualified second and finished in third, losing one position. Now, Liam is kind of a hard case to look at, because if you just compare those first two races, objectively qualifying was going pretty horribly for him, but he did improve in his actual finishing position from the first race to the second, given that he didn't finish the first race. The trouble here is when you bring in the comparison of the person who replaced him, Yuki Tsunoda. In the first two races in Australia and China, Yuki Tsunoda, in a subpar car in the VCARB, made it all the way to Q3 in both races. He qualified 5th in Australia and 9th in China. However, in both of those Grand Prix, I think it's important to note that he actually lost positions. Yuki finished both of those races outside of the points, finishing 12th in Australia and 16th in China. Yuki's first points, however, were scored in China in the sprint race, where he qualified 8th and finished 6th, gaining 2 positions. And the other trouble for Liam, I think, in these first two races was the fact that Yuki's rookie teammate on the junior team, Isack Hadjar, also outperforming him. Despite Isaac's pretty heartbreaking crash at the beginning of the season in Australia, he did qualify for that race in P11. And in China, he actually made it all the way to Q3, qualifying 7th, meaning that in the head-to-head between Yuki and Isack, Yuki outqualified Isack in Australia, and Isack actually outqualified him in China, but they both were consistently outqualifying Liam. So I think if you just look at it at the first two races, numbers-wise, I think the bigger argument for Liam's replacement was the fact that not only was he being outperformed by Yuki Tsunoda, who does have more experience, but was the direct competitor for that seat originally, but he was also being outperformed by Isack Hadjar, who was also a rookie with far less experience in a subpar car. While I don't necessarily think that 2 races is enough to actually judge a driver off of, I think it's even hard that we're judging these drivers off of 6 races instead of seeing a full season picture. I think what was potentially a little bit apparent is that they made the wrong decision in the first place. Had Yuki actually been able to be in that seat from the very beginning of the season, I think we would have seen a stronger head-to-head comparison. And so while I think 2 races is harsh, I actually think that the decision-making process was just wrong in the first place. While I did talk about it very much when we first saw that driver decision made, Yuki Tsunoda has a relationship with Honda, Honda is leaving Red Bull, Yuki has also been with the team for a number of seasons and potentially they did not see him growing past that point. Liam was this young rookie who seemed to have a lot of potential. The decision-making process is clear and we understand that we've also seen him actually have had testing times and it seemed like he was very fast in the Red Bull. But in a sort of sink or swim type of situation, it looked like Liam was going to sink. And when you compare it to the out-of-gate performance from both of those drivers on the junior team at the time, Yuki and Isack, he just was not performing. So then the question is, was the driver swap actually better for these drivers? Let's look at Yuki's head-to-head with Max as he became his teammate in Japan. Yuki ends up qualifying P15 in Japan at his home race. And Max, of course, took pole position. This is a hard race to actually look at qualifying head-to-head because we saw that Yuki was not given enough time to get that final lap in. That was a decision made by the team in terms of how much time he was going to be given in that qualifying position. And had he been given more time and gotten that second lap in, it's probable that we would have seen him qualify higher. And then when we look at the race itself, when you look at Japan, there was not a lot of overtaking done in that race, and most people did not improve in their positions. In fact, in the top 10 finishing positions, in those points finishing positions, there was only one overtake, and that was Lewis Hamilton overtaking Isack Hadjar. Otherwise, in those top 10, everyone finished exactly where they started in qualifying. So when you look at Yuki's performance, he actually made up 3 positions, finishing that race in 12th. Now, Yuki has not outqualified Max in the remaining races. He has, however, consistently made it to Q3. He qualified in Bahrain in 10th, Saudi Arabia in 8th, and then 10th again in our last race in Miami. Of those remaining 3 races, he has finished in the points twice, and he did have a DNF in Saudi Arabia. By comparison, Max has actually taken 2 pole positions in both Saudi Arabia and Miami, but he's actually dropped positions in both of those races, finishing Saudi Arabia in 2nd and Miami in 4th. Yuki has not had a podium yet, but if we look at it just sort of side to side, the car is not where either of these drivers would like it to be, and again, it's hard to compare a driver to Max Verstappen, but Yuki is doing one of the first things that he has to do, which is bringing that car into Q3, qualifying in those top 10 positions, and more often than not, finishing in the points. To compare that to the driver that he swapped with, Liam, unfortunately, we have not seen his performance improve greatly since moving back to VCARB. He has not brought that car into Q3 once. In Japan, he did outqualify Yuki coming in P14, but he ultimately lost 3 positions in that race, finishing P17 with Yuki finishing 5 places ahead of him. Liam has only outqualified his new teammate, Isack, 1 time. And in terms of how the races have finished, Isack has finished ahead of Liam every single race. This entire season, Liam has not finished in the points 1 time. And since Liam actually moved back to VCARB, Isack has scored 5 points. I think looking at these 4 drivers side by side, Max consistently remains in his own league, though he is trying to essentially fight the car to get to his old performance. But unfortunately, numbers-wise, Liam, who seemed to have the most potential and the most expectations set on him, has had the absolute lowest performance of these 3 drivers. And you can chalk that up to a lot of different things. It might be a mental toughness issue with the amount of stress that he had coming into that Red Bull seat as Max's teammate, and the pretty devastating demotion after only 2 races back to VCARB. It could be a comfort issue with the car. He trained pretty consistently trying to get comfortable with the Red Bull before moving into that seat, and then very quickly is back to a VCARB. Or it could just be that Isack and Yuki are better drivers than him right now. now. And Liam might have a lot to work on if he wants to remain in Formula One. Again, this is a by the numbers situation. I think one of the harder storylines objectively has been Liam, because I think as much hate as Liam was getting coming into this seat, Liam really had a lot of potential as a young driver. And he was a driver that I was personally excited to see come into Formula One. Again, we're only a quarter of the way through the season, and this is sort of a first quarter report card for these drivers. And maybe a progress report getting sent home will give Liam the kind of motivation that he needs to lock in and move forward. But right now we're looking at Yuki Tsunoda, a driver who feels like he was kind of overlooked in favor of Liam, and Isack Hadjar, a young rookie who seems to be very comfortable very quickly and have a lot of performance in him. And we're comparing him to a driver that really had a lot of hype around him and a lot of expectation. And unfortunately, right now, Liam is not living up to that expectation. So in terms of who's winning the sort of Red Bull camp, Max Verstappen is obviously sitting at the top. Yuki Tsunoda is outperforming Liam in the Red Bull, though there's definitely room for improvement, and I'm sure we'd like to see Yuki get closer to Max. And Isack Hadjar is definitely winning the sort of rookie battle, and potentially getting a lot of focus for that future of Red Bull after Max decides to retire or depart for another team. So that kind of wraps up both Red Bull and VCARB. Let's move on to the next team. And okay, we have now arrived at Ferrari. Ferrari is currently sitting fourth in the Constructors' Championship at 94 points, directly behind Red Bull, who currently have 105. And of course, we're talking about Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. Now, this one is kind of an interesting one and a stressful one. As you guys know, I am personally a big Lewis Hamilton fan, and we need to kind of evaluate where we're at with his move from Mercedes to Ferrari. Before we even get into the head-to-head of the two drivers in Ferrari, it is kind of a reality check to look at the fact that Mercedes is outperforming Ferrari for sure. Mercedes sits second in the Constructors' Championship. Their cars are consistently out-qualifying the Ferraris, and George Russell currently is ahead of both Ferrari drivers in the driver standings, and Kimi Antonelli actually splits Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. So in terms of performance between Lewis Hamilton's old team and his new team, unfortunately, Mercedes is kind of winning that battle. And obviously, there's a lot to be said about the car when you're talking about this. Team-wise, Mercedes is outperforming them, and their car is outperforming the Ferrari as well, which is a pretty big shift from the last couple of years. Mercedes was not a contender for the championship last year. George was not knocking out these podiums the same way that he is currently. So head-to-head, Mercedes versus Ferrari, the car is winning at Mercedes. And hopefully, we will see some upgrades from the Ferrari side of things that will change that. Now let's drill down into the actual teammate pairing, Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. In the head-to-head for qualifying, just looking at the Grand Prix, excepting the sprint races, Lewis has outqualified his teammate 1 time, compared to 5 for Charles Leclerc. And in terms of race finishes, again, just in Grand Prix, not including the sprint races, Charles Leclerc has finished ahead of Lewis in every single race. And remember, both of them were actually disqualified at China. Now, when you bring in the actual sprint race qualifications, Lewis actually took a pole position in the sprint race in China and also won that race. Charles Leclerc, by comparison, qualified for that race 4th and finished 5th. And when you look at the Miami sprint race, Charles Leclerc did outqualify Lewis, but Lewis ended up on the podium. So one of the things that I would like to see from Ferrari is an understanding as to why the car is performing so much better for Lewis in particular when it comes to sprint races. Because both of those weekends, when you look at them, in China we see Lewis have this suddenly great performance. Opening in Australia, he qualified 7th and finished 8th. And then suddenly at the China sprint race, he takes pole position and wins that sprint race. But then as soon as we get into the Grand Prix, he drops back down. He qualifies 6th and the car is disqualified from the final race. So one of the things that I would love to see an understanding of on the Ferrari side is what's being done to these cars, especially in comparison for Lewis in particular, when we're going from a sprint race to an actual Grand Prix. If you look at his performance, we open the season in Australia with not the best performance. He qualifies 8th and then he loses 2 positions in the race and finishes 10th, luckily finishing inside the points, but obviously not where a 7-time world champion driving for one of the most iconic teams in the sport wants to be. But then suddenly, as soon as we get to China in the next race, we see him take pole position in the sprint race, and then we actually see him dominate that race and take home the win. But then instantly we see a drop in performance when we get into the Grand Prix itself. He qualifies 5th, and then both of those drivers end up being disqualified, giving Ferrari no points for that race. And we see the same thing happen in Miami. Lewis qualifies 7th for the sprint and finishes on the podium, which really was strategy if we're being honest, and he qualifies 12th in the Grand Prix and finishes 8th. So we are seeing him make up those positions in the race and actually finish in the points in Miami. But the thing that kind of points to an odd issue with the car and changes that are being made is the fact that we see such strong performance from Lewis for both sprint races, and then a declining performance in the Grand Prix themselves. Obviously, there are a number of different things that happen in a sprint race that kind of change what it would look like from a Grand Prix. The cars are lighter, they have less fuel. Generally speaking, other than in Miami, there's not a pit stop, and the race itself is obviously significantly shorter. And also when it comes to managing pace because of that tire degradation, they're able to sort of put the pedal to the metal, so to speak. And it is one of the more interesting things that I think is going on at Ferrari that I hope that we see a developmental change from, because we are just seeing this strong performance from the sprints, and then we just see it drop completely off when it comes to the Grand Prix. As objectively as we can be when it comes to Ferrari, Charles Leclerc is definitely winning this teammate battle right now. But I think we also know from both drivers, neither of them seem to be particularly gelling with their team right now. There have been battles over strategy. There have been arguments with their engineers over the radio. There have been consistent kind of misalignments with both of the drivers and the way the team's being run. And so I think there are some major issues at Ferrari. Charles Leclerc should be more comfortable with this car. He's been with the team for much longer. But he's also not necessarily getting the performance he would like to see. Lewis Hamilton has not been on the podium one time when it comes to Grand Prix this season, though obviously he has been on the podium for both of the sprint races. Charles Leclerc himself has only been on the podium once this season. That was in Bahrain when he finished third, and he has not had a sprint race podium himself. In China, he finished fifth, and in Miami, he actually did not start the sprint race. So right now, neither of these drivers are fighting for podiums. And I think from two of the most impressive drivers on this grid, we're seeing a lackluster performance when it comes to speed, qualifying, and final Grand Prix finishes. I think the numbers tell us that while Charles Leclerc is outperforming Lewis, both of these drivers are underneath what their potential could be for this season if their team would get it together a little bit. So in terms of a driver head-to-head here, we're seeing Charles Leclerc win this one, but hopefully I think we'll see both of these drivers improve if Ferrari makes some changes both to the car, their management, and their strategy. But to be honest, if you're a Ferrari fan, that's probably a pretty familiar feeling. Let's move on to one of the most interesting teammate stories on the grid this season, Williams. As you should probably already know, Carlos Sainz used to be at Ferrari but moved to Williams this year after Lewis Hamilton made his move to the team. And that was a big conversation about whether or not Alex Albon was going to be able to deal with the pressure. Something that I have talked about a lot when it comes to this pairing is the fact that Alex Albon really did not have competition before this. As much as we want to love Logan Sargent, we have to be objective and say that there really was not competition for Alex when Logan was his teammate. Last year, when Logan was replaced mid-season with Franco Colapinto, for the first time we really saw how Alex works under pressure. And we knew that pressure was going to be upped when Carlos Sainz was announced to be his future teammate. Carlos is a race winner. He's coming off of racing for a team that was previously fighting for the Constructors' Championship, and he is this high-caliber driver that we saw a lot of conversation about when he was actually available to be a driver for a new team. All of that being said, Alex hasn't had that level of competition since Max was his teammate. And back then, there wasn't a conversation of whether or not Alex would outperform Max. It was just a conversation of whether or not he could perform up to the standards of being in that second seat. At Williams, he has become the face of that team. And before Carlos was signed, it was very much this conversation of him being the future of that team. So when we see Carlos coming in to take that second seat, the question becomes, can Alex handle that? And can he remain a priority driver when Carlos is actually the second seat? And when we look at the head-to-head, it shows some pretty interesting numbers. So let's break this down head-to-head for Alex and Carlos. Did Alex actually sink or did he swim? When we look at the qualifying positions, they're actually tied. And what's interesting about this is at the top of the season, Alex outqualified Carlos each race. First 3 races, Alex outqualifies Carlos easily. Alex actually makes it to Q3 every single one of those races. But now that Carlos is actually getting comfortable with that car, we're seeing him start to outqualify Alex. For the last 3 races, Carlos has actually outqualified Alex. But when we talk about the Grand Prix and the way that they finish these races, Carlos has actually only beat Alex in a single race. That was in Saudi Arabia where he finished 8th and Alex finished 9th. Carlos has finished in the points 3 times this season, and Alex has actually finished in the points 5 out of 6 races. Carlos has also DNF'd 2 separate races, whereas Alex has finished every single Grand Prix. And when you add in the sprint races, Alex is absolutely outperforming Carlos there. While neither of them have finished in the points for a sprint race, Alex has made it all the way to SQ3 for both races and Carlos has not. Alex finished 11th in both of the sprint races, not earning any points, and Carlos finished 17th in the China sprint race and did not finish the Miami sprint race. It's hard to look at their speed spread when it comes to Grand Prix because of the fact that Carlos hasn't finished a couple of them, so the average differential becomes a little harder to weigh. However, if you do look at that average differential, Alex is significantly faster than Carlos. And again, it's hard to look at the actual pace here because Carlos has not finished as many races, so that average is not necessarily a fair comparison. What we're looking at here, I think, is that both of these drivers are thriving under competition. Carlos came into this position probably expecting to do better than Alex. That has been the narrative across the board, that Alex is a subpar driver when it comes to Carlos. And because Carlos and Alex fans seem to have a very strong opinion whenever you talk about anything, regardless of whether that's a fact or just an opinion, I do want to point out that I'm talking about the actual reporting that was happening when Carlos and Alex were announced as a driver pairing. I'm not saying that Alex is better than Carlos or that he was going to completely fall apart, and I'm not saying that Carlos is this terrible driver that absolutely took over Alex's team. I'm literally just talking about the narrative that we had walking in here. Carlos has had a better career with more podiums and actual race wins than Alex has up until this point. Alex was viewed as the future of Williams, and that future was called into question when the team was able to sign Carlos. With that being said, Alex is outperforming Carlos overall, but Carlos is starting to catch up, and I think both of those performances are happening because of a threat from the other. Carlos is expected to be outperforming Alex, and when he comes into the season and isn't, it pushes him to want to do better. On the flip side, Alex knows he's expected not to perform as well as Carlos. And coming out of the gate as strong as he had, I think surprised him. If you go back to some of his interviews from the early races in Australia and China, it does seem like he's a little shocked that they're doing as well as they are. And so there's a lot of effort and confidence being infused into him at the very beginning of this season. What we do know from these two drivers is that Williams is a completely different team than we're used to seeing. The car is performing so much better than it used to. There are still some management and strategy issues that could be adjusted, and there are still some teammate pairing things that could be adjusted as well. But overall, the teamwork from the team is working. And again, overall. And these two drivers are performing better under competition and threat from each other. I think if you look at the numbers, Carlos is trending upwards, and at a certain point, you're probably going to see those lines cross. However, under that same pressure, we could see Alex start to perform even better than he was before. And so I think going into this, objectively, Alex has sort of won the first quarter of the report, but Carlos is improving. The question will be, can Alex improve at the same rate? Does he feel that same threat of competition from Carlos? And does he feel like his pace itself can be faster than Carlos? These are questions that we don't have the answers to, but objectively, my projection based on these numbers, based on the performance so far, is that Carlos will continue to improve and so will Alex. And I think you're going to start to see some real head-to-head where they're sort of trading race to race. Because right now, Carlos has figured out qualifying, but Alex has figured out the race itself. And so that balance has led to a point differential in Alex's favor, and we'll see where we go from here. So that covers Williams. Let's move on to Haas. Haas is a unique situation because both of the drivers are new to the team this year. While Ollie Bearman is our only rookie, Esteban Ocon previously was racing at Alpine last year. And so while it's not exactly an even match, one of them is actually a very experienced Formula One driver and also a race winner, and the other is a complete rookie who only had one race under his belt after a pretty impressive debut last year. Both of these drivers are getting comfortable with a new car and with a new team. And objectively, Ollie actually had more experience with the Haas going into this season. Because while Esteban was actually at Alpine driving last season, Ollie was the reserve driver for both Ferrari and Haas, and spent a number of FP1 sessions last year in the Haas car. So in terms of Ollie's actual comfort in the car, it's possible that coming into this season, Ollie actually felt a little bit more comfortable than Esteban did, just based off of the fact that he's had more experience with that vehicle. But what do the numbers say? What do these teammates look like head to head, and which one of them is outperforming the other? In terms of Grand Prix qualifying, again, sprints being accepted from this, Esteban and Ollie are actually 3 for 3, which also is important to note that Ollie actually didn't participate in qualifying for Australia for our season opener. So one of Esteban's sort of head-to-head wins in terms of qualifying was without an actual competition on the other side due to the fact that Ollie didn't participate in the session. And it hasn't been a one-to-one comparison in terms of who's tracking upwards. They've sort of traded back and forth, and they've also only both had one Q3 appearance. So sort of one-to-one, Ollie and Esteban are evenly matched when it comes to qualifying. In terms of race finishes, Esteban beats Ollie out by 1, given the fact that Ollie did not finish in Miami, and you can also, of course, see that reflected in the point spread. Esteban has 14 points to Ollie's 6. So with Haas, it's a pretty evenly matched situation, and neither of these drivers are really pulling out an incredible kind of performance that's worth writing home about. What I will say about Haas is that to some degree, they are rebuilding again. Last year, with their new team principal, was the first year that they were actually a profitable team. And this year, we obviously are seeing them make big changes with brand new drivers, a new race engineer for Esteban, who is also the first female engineer in Formula One, and kind of rebuilding this team dynamic to be a new type of team. And so I think in a rebuilding phase, you're always going to see a period of time where they are not necessarily performing to the highest extent. However, there's definitely potential in both of these drivers, and potentially eventually we could see them start to perform even better if the car and everything is kind of lining up. But neither of these drivers are particularly outperforming the other. To some degree, it does feel like Esteban should be significantly outperforming Ollie, just given his personal experience. However, again, like I mentioned, both of these guys are new to this team and new to this car. And I think Ollie's actual experience with the car probably helps him match up to Esteban's experience in the sport. This teammate pairing is one that we'll just kind of have to watch go out throughout the entire season and see in the second quarter of this season which of these two drivers actually performs higher, or if they continue to be pretty evenly matched. Next up in the constructor standings, we have Aston Martin. And I think these two drivers are kind of interesting to look at because, as we all know, we have rookie Fernando Alonso and kind of the grid's punching bag, Lance Stroll. This team, I think, is in that period right before they start to rebuild. We know that next year they're going to have a new engine supplier in Honda, and we also know that they are bringing over Adrian Newey, and that will be a very big difference in their car development. For those of you who are kind of new to Formula One, Adrian Newey is one of the most legendary designers in this sport, and they spent a lot of money in bringing him over from Red Bull. If you listen to some of the team history episodes I've done previously on this podcast, you'll find that Adrian Newey has been associated with a number of championship-winning teams. Most recently, Red Bull and all of Max Verstappen's championships, which it is important to note, most recently went with Honda's actual power unit. So there's a huge amount of development and star power that's coming to this team next year. However, in terms of who are in the driver's seats, we obviously haven't seen that performance necessarily line line up. Now, Fernando has won world championships and is a legendary driver in this sport, and we should never disrespect that. However, his results have absolutely been showing that he is past his prime. And I'd say at the start of the season, it was actually kind of surprising because we saw Lance Stroll outqualify Fernando Alonso for the first 2 races of the season. Fernando also DNF'd both of those races, as well as the Miami sprint race. Fernando has yet to score a point this season, and his highest race finish has actually been 11th. Lance, on the other hand, has actually scored points twice, and those were in those first 2 races of the season. And he also scored points at the Miami sprint race, which Fernando did not finish. So for the last 4 races of the season, we've actually seen Fernando outperform Lance, but Lance has a little bit of a leg up from that beginning performance for his first part of the season. And it's always interesting to look at a team pairing where we see one driver get so much more attention than the other, and we see that all of the points scored for this team are actually by the other driver, by Lance. Generally speaking, I think this team needs the next year kind of reset in order for us to see real performance from these drivers. But I also wonder if we're going to see Fernando kind of retire, because despite the fact that technically speaking, these last 4 races he has outperformed Lance, this is just such a different performance than we're used to seeing from Fernando. And I think at a certain point, you have to look at whether you want your legacy to look like this or if you want your legacy to look like what it used to. Do you want to be remembered as a world champion, or do you want to be remembered as someone who can't kind of decide when it's time to retire? With Lance, I'm sure he has learned a lot from Fernando, and I think that's been a really positive relationship for the two of them, but I do think there might be value in Fernando moving into an advisory role where we can actually see a strong driver in that first seat, especially if we're going to see a much stronger car behind the actual development of it. And then Lance can sit in that second driver position, and we can see that team actually start to perform. Either way, Aston Martin has just not had a season to write home about yet, and it'll be interesting to see if we see any adjustments, if we see either of these drivers start to perform better, or quite frankly, if we start to see Lance start to pick things back up. Because at the beginning of the season, those 2 openers and then also the Miami sprint, I have to be honest, I was pretty shocked and impressed at where Lance was going. So I'd be interested to see if he can bring that back. And if he does actually bring that performance back, what does that mean to Fernando? How does he feel about that? Does it kind of motivate him to actually retire? Or does he feel like right now, since both of them are not performing over these last 4 races, again, just talking about the Grand Prix and not necessarily the sprint races, does Fernando feel like it's the car that's in his way? Only time will tell, but our progress report basically says that actually, technically speaking, in points, Lance is winning this battle. And in terms of qualifying and race pace, technically Fernando is winning in that section, especially over the last 4 races. But Lance Stroll is currently responsible for all 14 points that have been scored by Aston Martin. Moving on, we're skipping over VCARB as we have already talked about them in the Red Bull section of this episode. And the next down the line, currently 9th in constructor standings, are Alpine. And this one is kind of a sticky situation given the fact that we are getting ready to see a driver swap take place at Imola. For these first 6 races, which is what we're talking about in this sort of progress report situation, we've had 2 drivers, Jack Doohan and Pierre Gasly. Now, Pierre has obviously been with the team for longer, and Jack is actually a rookie, but Jack has been with the team as a reserve driver for quite some time and was waiting for this promotion, which I think is always hard to see someone who works pretty hard for something and then ultimately just does not deliver what the team is looking for. Jack was given 4 more races than Liam Lawson was before being dropped, though Liam Lawson was obviously dropped down to a junior team and Jack Doohan was relegated back to being a reserve driver. But let's actually look head to head at Jack Doohan's numbers and Pierre Gasly's numbers and see whether or not we agree that he should have been dropped and that Franco Colapinto has a better shot at performing in this seat. In terms of qualifying, Pierre outqualified Jack for every single race except for the most recent in Miami. Jack has had 0 Q3 appearances while Pierre has had 3, and Pierre has scored 7 points across all races and sprints while Jack scored 0. Jack has DNF'd 2 races and Pierre has DNF'd 1 race and been disqualified from a second, so they've actually completed and counted the same number of Grand Prix races. And in terms of speed overall, Pierre is definitely faster, both in qualifying time and in actual race pace. What's hard to say about Jack is that he's not necessarily performing so poorly that we think he shouldn't be a Formula 1 driver at all, but he's also not performing at a way where he is so close to his teammate that it's hard to argue the point. And additionally, it's even more difficult to have an average performance when someone like Franco Colapinto is waiting in the wings to take your seat. Head-to-head, Pierre has shown himself to be a better driver over these first 6 races, and Pierre had already pretty much solidified himself as that main driver in this team, especially given that Esteban Ocon had left the year prior. And so what you're looking for in a team that is not necessarily competing for championships is not just a good second driver that can support your first driver, but a driver who can consistently try to score points and definitely finish races. Jack objectively wasn't showing that that was his performance. Could he potentially have gotten there over the rest of the season? Anything is possible, and generally speaking, I think it's hard to judge a driver without a full season worth of experience. But to some degree, we weren't really seeing Jack improve. In Australia at the season opener, he qualified 14th. His qualifying positions after that were 18th, 19th, 11th, 17th, and 14th. So to some degree, that's actually a decline overall in his performance performance. And in terms of where he finished the races themselves, he did not finish the first race of the season in Australia. He finished 13th in China, 15th in Japan, 14th in Bahrain, 17th in Saudi Arabia, and he did not finish the race in Miami. That kind of points to a general decline. Again, anything with the right amount of support and talent, if it's there, could have been better over the year. But if you have talent like Franco Colapinto in the wings and you think he might be a better fit, it's hard to argue that Jack was actually putting in the performance that would justify him staying in that seat. And it's possible that Jack's better in a support role helping develop that car. And we won't really know whether or not Franco is the better fit until we give him the same number of races and give him another quarter, so to speak, in this season. Technically, that would be another 6 races, which is when we will do this progress report again. But we also do know that technically he has only been contracted for 5 races. So we'll see how much Franco actually gets in terms of experience. I will say the Alpine situation is always a sad one. Seeing a driver get kind of bumped out of a space after their dream has come true is tough to watch. However, I will say the numbers don't necessarily point to the fact that Jack would have improved overall. I would have loved to have seen him get the chance, but unfortunately Formula One currently only has 20 seats and next year it will still only have 22. And a lot of that means that we are going to see drivers who we think might actually have a chance to be nurtured into better drivers dropped before we actually see that happen because there's someone who might be better in the wings. And that's just sort of the nature of Formula One. So that wraps up Alpine. Let's move to our final team on the grid, who is currently sitting in 10th place, Kick Sauber. This team is another one that has kind of a weird situation where both drivers are new to the team, but one is a very experienced driver and the other is a rookie. Our drivers here are Nico Hülkenberg and Gabriel Bortoleto. Now remember, Gabriel Bortoleto actually won Formula 2 last year. However, we haven't really seen a strong performance from either of these drivers. In terms of a qualifying head-to-head, neither of these drivers has made it to Q3 yet this season. And the only driver to score points this season was Nico Hülkenberg, and that was in the very first race. Gabriel Bortoleto has outqualified Nico twice, but he has only finished a race ahead of Nico one time. If you count Nico's disqualification in Bahrain, then he has finished ahead of him twice. Ultimately, head-to-head, as expected, Nico is outperforming Gabriel, but neither of them are really doing anything impressive this season. We've seen both of their performances and their cars sort of decline throughout the season, which makes sense given the fact that they are sitting comfortably in that last slot in constructors. And one thing to point out is that of the 20 drivers on the grid, there are only 4 who have not scored any points, one of which is Jack Doohan, who is no longer racing in Formula One, and another is Gabriel Bortoleto. So sort of head-to-head, Gabriel Bortoleto is losing to his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, as he probably should be as a rookie. But it's kind of a disappointing performance for someone we expected to do pretty well this season. But objectively, when you look at both of them, most likely the car is part of that issue. And we'll have to see if the car upgrades in a way that we are able to see performance from either of these drivers. Another important thing to note is that similarly to Aston Martin, we have a very big change coming for Sauber next year. Audi will be taking over the team, which means we'll see a pretty big change in the culture. It's a big part of why they wanted Nico Hülkenberg in that seat. And hopefully it means that they're using most of this season to just prepare for next. And we'll hopefully see better performance from these drivers next year. So that kind of takes us through the head-to-head of teammates across the grid. I want to very briefly talk about our rookies, because we do have 6 rookies this season if you include Liam Lawson. And now that we've been through 6 races, we're a quarter of the way through, I think it's worth taking a look at these rookies and seeing which ones of them are performing in a way that are pretty exciting, and also which ones of them are not necessarily living up to their expectations. The 6 sort of rookies that we have this season, and I say sort of again because Liam technically does not qualify as a rookie, were Kimi Antonelli, Liam Lawson, Isack Hadjar, Jack Doohan, Gabriel Bortoleto, and Ollie Bearman. Across the board, these drivers are in various kinds of cars. Kimi Antonelli is obviously at the top of the grid with a Mercedes, and Liam Lawson started at the top of the grid with a Red Bull but then was downgraded to a VCARB. Isack Hadjar is also in a VCARB, Ollie Bearman is in a Haas, Gabriel Bortoleto, as we just discussed, is in that bottom team in Sauber, and Jack Doohan was at Alpine. Across the board, when we look at these 6, I think there are 2 very strong standouts, and those are Kimi Antonelli and Isack Hadjar. Of the rookies, Kimi is the highest in the standings with 48 points scored. He also set a record for becoming the youngest pole sitter in the history of Formula One, and he has been steadily improving across the board, both in qualifying and in race. Ollie Bearman is actually the closest in the point standings to Kimi, and he only has 6 points. Directly beneath him is Isack Hadjar with 5 points, and then Liam Lawson, Jack Doohan, and Gabriel Bortoleto all remain scoreless. So if you look at that in terms of points, we're 50-50. 3 rookies have scored points, 1 who has scored a significant amount more, and 3 rookies remain scoreless. Of those scoreless rookies, 2 of them are the ones who have seen their seat changed. Liam was dropped down from Red Bull down to VCARB, and Jack Doohan obviously lost his seat. One of the things that I think is actually interesting is when you look at this, potentially Gabriel Bortoleto Bortoleto came in with sort of the easiest go of it, because even though he won F2 and should have been the most promising rookie coming in, he also came down to a bottom tier team, and his teammate is also getting used to that car and is not performing very well. So it's really not a conversation of whether or not he's performing up to the capabilities that he needs to be, because his teammate and his team overall are not really performing very well in general. And so you have the situation where he doesn't have the same amount of pressure. You're not seeing the same amount of disappointment or expectations dropped when he doesn't make it out of Q1. By contrast, Isack Hadjar is really the only rookie who's outperforming his teammate. He's consistently outperforming Liam. And we also really saw him strongly bounce back from a disappointing opening in Australia. And so I think when you look at performance for the rookies, Kimi Antonelli and Isack Hadjar really have been the ones that are standing out to me. Kimi Antonelli obviously has a stronger vehicle and a stronger team. They're sitting second in the Constructors' Championship, and that is going to be a part of that very wide berth that he has between himself and the rest of the rookies. But he also had a large amount of expectation. Replacing Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes was never going to be a situation where he did not have a high expectation put on him. We are talking about how fast he is, how young he is, and whether or not this decision made a lot of sense. And there was a lot of speculation as to whether or not Kimi Antonelli's future with Mercedes was part of why Lewis Hamilton left. And so I don't think that there are higher expectations than that coming into Formula One for your rookie season. But Kimi has come in and performed, and I think we're consistently seeing him improve. And so that performance is going to continue to improve as well. Isack, on the other hand, had very little expectation coming in, and also has performed in a very strong way in a situation that is very tumultuous. He's already had two different teammates, and he's seen what happens when you don't perform in a Red Bull kind of scenario. And so for him to be performing in the way that he is, I think is quite impressive. So my rookie ranking kind of goes Kimi Antonelli, then Isack Hadjar, and after that we have Ollie Bearman, who again is performing pretty steadily and kind of middle of the road. He has scored points, he is doing well, but we're not seeing very big standout shocking performances from him. But head to head with his teammate, he's doing well, and I think we'll consistently continue to see him have a steady career this season. Do I think that there will necessarily be a shocking moment where we see him hit a podium or a race win? I don't think so, but I do think Ollie is one to watch in the long term. Ollie is a steady driver, he's still young, and he's performing in a way that is strong for a rookie. After that, technically, we should probably put Gabriel Bortoleto up there, as out of the three remaining, he's the only one who hasn't had any seat changes. But I also think there hasn't really been a lot of performance there. It's a bit lackluster. After that, Liam Lawson, and then finally we have Jack Doohan. And so that's sort of my rookie ranking of the 6. The questions for me moving forward, kind of in this head-to-head situation and in the rookie situation, is what we'll see in the next quarter. I kind of want to do these check-ins every 6 races since we have 24 this season, and see how we see these drivers improve or decline. Kimi Antonelli, I think, is going to be one of the most surprising performances and the quickest change. Ferrari has a lot to do, and with Kimi, I think we could see some head-to-head threat with George Russell, and I think that could be a really interesting story to follow here. Isack Hadjar, I think, is going to consistently outperform Liam, and the question will be what Liam's future looks like if that's the case, because as Isack improves, Liam's decline looks a little worse. If Liam was competing against someone who wasn't having a strong performance, it would be easier to say that it's just the junior team, it's just rookies. But because we're seeing Isack perform very well, it's hard to kind of chalk it up to that. So hopefully this has been interesting, kind of breaking things down by the numbers rather than necessarily emotion, but also recognizing that numbers don't tell the whole story without the context. I think there is a lot of work to be done across the season, and hopefully we'll see some interesting upgrades in Imola and across the European triple header that we're headed into. I'm curious for you if these numbers actually changed anything in your perception of these drivers kind of head to head, whether that's a teammate ranking or a rookie ranking. And I always want to know kind of your questions, your thoughts, and your feelings on this, but especially in an episode like this, which was entirely commentary and sort of thoughts and stats. You can always connect with me on social media at Marissa Kumari. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Threads, and of course YouTube. If you're listening to this podcast somewhere else and you'd prefer to watch me talk the entire time, you can do that on the YouTube version of this podcast by searching just my same username, Marissa Kumari. And then additionally, you can always join the Grid Chat Discord server. There is a link for that down in the episode description below. We use that Discord server to watch races together, kind of chat. We have a fantasy league, and of course, you can always ask questions. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of a discussion about this episode as well. And I think it's a really fun community of people who just really love this sport and are generally not judgmental. That's everything for today. It's kind of been a hefty episode of numbers, stats, and just my general feelings and analysis. I'd love to know what you guys think, what you're excited for in this season, and who you think stands out to you the most now that you have all of this information. So be sure to find me on social media. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening, whether that's a podcast app or on YouTube. And I will see you for the race recap for Imola.